بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri, in the section on mu'amalat, on commercial transactions, we are continuing to look at the section on the impermissible transactions. And we looked at the fact that what's meant by al-fasid here is transactions that are not permitted, with the broader meaning of fasad, not just the more specific meaning of the corrupt transactions, right? And we stopped at impermissible conditions in a sale because of, and we looked at some of the governing principles related to impermissible conditions, right? That conditions are either confirming the contract, and that's fine, or they're conditions without benefit, and they're just ignored, or they're conditions where there is benefit to one or either party, and they're not conditions entailed by the contract. Such a condition would corrupt the contract unless they are customarily made. And the Majalla was quite expansive regarding that, because the تعارف الناس على التعامل بالشروط, right? And that's what generally fatwa is upon, unless the condition either leads to dispute or is contrary to some specific principle in the Sharia, or leads to a recognized harm in the Sharia. Right? So amongst such impermissible conditions are conditions of riba, for example. And of course, one can't give oneself fatwa and commercial transactions. There are a lot of things. If people had even a little bit of knowledge, they would see that a lot of transactions around them are problematic. And even sometimes religious people fall into impermissible transactions because they just don't realize, right? So recently I ran into somebody, religious, pious, God-fearing, but they didn't know that credit card debt is haram. And it's aynur riba. It's pure riba. It's actually a gross type of riba. Even financially, it doesn't make sense to get into that kind of debt. So that's something that requires attention, that if one is engaging in stuff, one needs to be in touch with the people of knowledge and to ask and confirm and clarify. So now when it comes to custom, we just touched upon it briefly, right? That the idea of al-urf, right? That the conditions that are customarily made. So there's the principle that al-ma'rufu urfan kal-mashruti shartan. Something customarily known is as if contractually stipulated. So, what are customs and norms are frequently of consideration in the Sharia. Similarly, the ulama mention a legal maxim, al-'adatu muhakkamatun. Custom has the weight of law, right? And that's when it is a sound custom, that is prevalent, right? A sound custom that is prevalent. So it being sound, that it does not go against the principles of the Sharia. So it's not a specific condition that is prohibited, or it doesn't violate some established principle of the Sharia, or does not lead to a mafsada, some harm that is recognized in the Sharia. So he says, ومن باع عبد قال الإمام القدوري رحمه الله ومن باع عبدا على أن يعتقه المشتري أو يدبره أو يكاتبه أو باع أمة على أن يستولدها فالبيع فاسد. So someone who sells a slave on condition that the buyer free the slave, or make them mudabbar or mukatab, which are two ways of a slave acquiring their freedom, or they sold a female slave on condition that the buyer have children with the female slave. Such a condition is fasid, right? Because such a condition makes the sale itself fasid. فَالْبَيْعُ fasid. So this makes the transaction itself corrupt, voidable. Because this is a sale with a condition. And the Prophet ﷺ forbade sales with conditions. But the prohibition of this is not intrinsic, but it is لِمَا يُؤَدِّ, it's because of what it can lead to of dispute. Or harm. So the condition, Imam Al-Maydani has a nice discussion here summarizing the rulings related to conditions in contracts, and you do well as a student of knowledge to write that section out, maybe even to diagram it. The main thing he does not mention, from what I referred to in the class, in my explanation, was the issue of urf, because it was, it's a significant point. وكذلك, likewise, meaning البيع فاسد, the contract is corrupt. لو باع عبدا على أن يستخدمه البائع شهرا. Likewise, the condition, likewise, the sale is corrupt, it's fasid, if someone sells a slave on condition that the seller used the slave for a month. Because here this is two contracts in a contract. The first was, Prophet forbade al-bay' wa shart, a sale with conditions that could lead to dispute. Here is to put two contracts into one. So here you have a sale transaction. The sale entails that the buyer owns the thing. But if you put a condition that I sell you this now, on condition that I can use it for a month, could lead to dispute, because once you get it, you want to use it. Because the reason someone buys something is because they want ownership of that thing. So to put this condition, the asl is that this is mufsid. But where such a condition is customarily made and does not lead to dispute, then the same principle would apply. Right? It applies across the board. It's not intrinsically prohibited. Right? And this is نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن صفقتين في صفقة. The Prophet ﷺ forbade two contracts in one. And the ulama explain that two contracts in one is because the two contracts have conflicting considerations. For example, here this is a sale and then lending, or a sale plus, if you put some material consideration, it's a sale going in one direction and then a rental in the other. So I say, I'll sell you this house on condition that I can continue to use it for 3 months. Now, if there's no custom, what happens? I sell you the house for $500,000. You pay up the house. He said, but on condition I use it for 3 months. Once you get the house, it's yours now. And he said, but I want it now. I said, oh, but in the contract, I can use it for 3 months. So things like that can lead to dispute. So the asl is that such conditions shouldn't be made. Rather, we should keep the two things separate. Because people frequently don't pay attention to the details of contracts. This is one of the hikmas of the prohibition against multiple transactions in one. Right? So the sister bought the house. What's her focus? On buying the house. She didn't pay attention to the detail, which is on condition that I use it for 3 months. So it can lead to dispute. And this is also part of bigger value of that having taradi, clear mutual agreement, not having too many details in the contract could lead to not being genuinely genuinely accepting of the details. Do you always read the small print? No, who reads the small? Well, some people do. I have a friend who, until I convince him otherwise, even like, buying something, if there's, like small print, he'd read the whole thing before agreeing to the contract. His son almost died because he insisted on reading the whole contract with the hospital before they'd start the operation. I said, let me do it. He said, no, it's my son. I said, well, if he's dead, he's not your son anymore. So we had to intervene. I said, look, I'm going to take you to court if anything happens to your son. I'm older than you, please listen to me. Because he wasn't listening to any religious argument. His son's like choking to death, possibly. He says, no, I want to see the contract between us, and then I want to read it. Those kinds of things. But here, if there is established custom in certain things, and frequently there is, when people buy things, very often, like for example with homes, for example, and the same principles would apply to rental. Right? If someone finds a house mid-month, right? They say, well, yeah, you can rent it till the beginning of the month. In a sale, it's not infrequent that the sale would happen now, but they'll say, well, but we'll give it to you in 2 months' time. That we have the house till the year's end. Islamically, be more cautious, if you can pull it off, to say, okay, let's agree to effect the sale on such and such date. But the person wants the sale done now. So these things, when they don't lead to dispute, and they're clearly defined in our times, most of these things are customarily agreed upon. أو دارا على أن يسكنها, or likewise, if someone sells a home on condition that the seller, al-ba'i', the one who sold it, so I sell you this house on condition that I can live in it for a specified period of time. Same thing. The asl in the madhab is that this corrupts the transaction for the reason that we mentioned. أو على أن يقرضه المشتري درهما, or someone sells something on condition that the seller loaned them an amount of money. And this can be problematic because it could also entail riba, depending on how this arrangement is set up. أو على أن يهدي له هدية, or on condition that the buyer give them a gift. Of course, a specified gift, because the gift is not even specified, then that would lead to dispute more broadly. All of these because it's two contracts in one. A sale plus a gift. What's the gift doing in the contract? Keep those two things separate. And it goes back to the principle. Any contractual clause that has benefit to either side and is not entailed by the contract itself, properly shouldn't be part of the contract, should be kept separate from the contract. Break it into two agreements. But when it's customarily made, it does not invalidate the contract. Then what does he say? ومن باع عينا على ألا يسلمها إلى رأس الشهر فالبيع فاسد. And whoever sells an item on condition that it not be delivered till the end of the month, the sale is corrupt. Because a sale entails that the rights of ownership now be granted to the buyer. So if you sell something on condition that it not be delivered, and so it shouldn't be put into the contract. We could agree off contract that look, I'll sell you this, but let me just finish off these few things in it. Off contract, it's done. There's no problem in it. Even if it's done in writing. Shaykh Ali Haidar mentions that in his Sharh al-Majalla. Even if they agreed in writing outside the contract, it's considered like a promise. Because this too could lead to disputes. Say, I bought it, now I want the thing. And we look at the conditions for forward sales, the basis of forward sales, which is a sale made now, but the item is deliverable in the future. The basis of which is it's not permissible except for the salam transaction. We look at that when we come to it. It's in an upcoming chapter. وَمَنْ بَاعَ جَارِيَةً إِلَّا حَمْلَهَا فَالْبَيْعُ فَاسِدٌ. Whoever sells a female slave except for her fetus, the sale is corrupt. And the basis of this is that there's a principle, and we touched upon this earlier when we talked about من باع رطلا من باع صبرة طعام واستثنى منه أرطالا معلومة. Right? And Imam al-Quduri did not allow it, but we saw that the relied upon position is that it's allowed. Right? That however, if you buy a pile of food and you excluded a certain number, a specified number of units of it, is it permitted to make that exception? This should be clear because you guys should be writing out the text. The Imam Quduri said, no, you can't do that. And that's the narration from Abu Hanifa. However, as the commentators make clear, the stronger position is that it is permissible. And the condition is ما صح بيعه صح استثناؤه. Right? That anything that you're allowed to sell on its own is permitted to exclude from a contract. So can you sell a fetus on its own when it's still in the mother? No. So you cannot make that an exception in the sale. ما صح بيعه صح استثناؤه. And Imam Allama al-Maydani puts it in another wording, والأصل أن ما لا يصح إفراده بالعقد لا يصح استثناؤه من العقد. Same thing. If anything that you cannot sell separately in a contract, you cannot make an exception of it in the contract. And the fetus, the haml, is like that. Right? Because until the child is born, the infant is considered a part of the mother. Now we'll see selling an infant separately. There's a separate matter. ومن اشترى ثوبا على أن يقطعه البائع ويخيطه قميصا أو قباء. What do you have? فالبيع فاسد. أو نعلا على أن يحذوها أو يشركها فالبيع فاسد. So he says that whoever buys a garment, whoever buys a piece of cloth on condition that the seller cut it and stitch it into a long shirt or into a cloak, or if one buys a sandal on condition that it be adjusted by the seller, adjusted, so because they used to, they used to make the sandals, like a bigger size, but it has to be, cut to fit, and then they would put the strap. So on condition that it be adjusted and the straps placed, he says such a transaction is fasid, is corrupt, because it is again a bay' with a shart. But here, and that's the qiyas, that's the legal analogy. But the istihsan, the legal preference, is, as the commentator mentions, that it's permitted. He says, وَفِي الْإِسْتِحْسَانِ يَجُوزُ لِلتَّعَامُلِ فِيهِ. Right? That this is permitted. Because how would people buy clothing from a tailor? They'd buy the cloth and then say, stitch it. Now there's many ways you could have a tailoring contract. You could turn it into a aqd istisna, a manufacturing contract. But many tailors would say, buy the cloth, right, and then stitch it, right? Because people, and there's different reasons. Because in some countries, for example, they say, look, we'll sell you the cloth and we'll stitch it to you for free. People like the idea of free. So of course they inflate the price of the cloth to cover their stitching prices. Or, so if this is done, so the condition, the problem with it is that it lead to dispute. Are you buying the cloth or are you getting the person to stitch it? Two different contracts. So this condition is problematic because it could lead to dispute. Because the sale entails ownership. Now the cloth is yours, take it. What if you're not satisfied with the second part of the sale, which is stitch it to my size? So it would confuse the contract. But these things, they say, al-urfu rafi'un lin-niza'. Custom lifts dispute. Right? Because that which is al-ma'ruf kal-mashrut, because the things that are customarily known are as if agreed upon in the contract. Right? So, but to the extent that one can simplify, clarify, it's superior. And here, and then he says, وَالْبَيْعُ إِلَى نَيْرُوز وَالْمَهْرَجَانِ وَصَوْمِ النَّصَارَى إذا وفطر اليهود إذا لم يعرف المتبايعان ذلك فاسد. A sale that where the price is due, البيع إلى, meaning البيع باشتراط الثمن, a sale with the price due, when Nayroz comes, which is the spring festival in the Persian tradition, والمهرجان, which is the harvest festival, right? Or the fast of the Christians, or to the breaking of the fast of the Jews. If the two parties don't know when this is impermissible. Why? Because a deferred sale, a sale with the price being deferred is permissible. The condition is وصح يعني البيع بالثمن المؤجل بتأجيل معلوم. Right? It's permitted to make a sale with a deferred price on condition that the period of deferral be known. whether it be one payment or installments or whatever, but with a known period of deferral. But if we don't know, do you know when the Mahrajan is? When the harvest festival is? Do you know? Do you? Do you know when it is? So imagine if I sold you this mic, that this is payable when Neiroz comes. I don't know what Neiroz is. You don't either. Suddenly you say, I thought it was January. I said, no, it's whenever it is, and we at least to dispute. But if it's known, that would depend on our particular circumstances, or if it's customarily known, everybody knows, then that would again lift dispute. So in these, if it's known when this is, it would not corrupt it. But he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْبَيْعُ إِلَى الْحَصَادِ وَالدِّيَاسِ وَالْقِطَافِ وَقُدُومِ الْحَاجِ. It's not permitted to make a sale, a sale where the payment is due when the crops are harvested, because يَتَقَدَّمُ وَيَتَأَخَّرُ, because there's no specific date for it. Right? Or here in Canada, when the maple syrup starts flowing, because it fluctuates. What when they, when they cut and sift through the crop, like the wheat, for example. والقطاف, when the crop is harvested, or it's qitaf is when it's plucked. Qatafa, when it's plucked, like when the fruits are plucked. وَقُدُومِ الْحَاجِ, and when the pilgrims return. And this particularly in the old days, because the pilgrimage was a long journey. So if you're sitting in Delhi, it says, I'll pay you when the pilgrims come. They might not come at all. In the old days, one of the adab of going on Hajj was to bid farewell to all your friends and family, because a high percentage chance you wouldn't return. And it was so dangerous that actually in the books of Hanafi Fatwa, many of them mentions that Hajj is no longer obligatory. وَقَالُوا لَا يَجِبُ الْحَجِّ عَلَى أَهْلِ سَمَرْقَنْدِ. They said Hajj is not obligatory anymore for the people of Samarkand, because the general case was it was just so dangerous to go that you didn't have to do it. That's in those times. So things are much easier now. But if in some context these things are well known, such that there's no significant variance in them, then it would be valid. But it's not generally the case. فَإِن تَرَاضَيَا بِإِسْقَاطِ الْأَجَلِ قبل أن يأخذ الناس في الحصاد والدياس وقبل قدوم الحاج جاز البيع. But if the two parties agreed to drop a non-defined period of deferral, right, before people started harvesting or sifting, or before the pilgrim's return, then the sale becomes valid. And the underlying principle here is that if a corrupt condition is made, then a contract can be rectified before, as long as it still can be rectified. Because once the pilgrims come, they've come, khalas, the money is due, but the sin of the corruption, of the corrupt contract, remains. And that's very significant, that morally the bay' al-fasid is sinful. So one can make tasheeh, one can validate a corrupt contract. Of course, validating it lifts the shar'i fasad. It doesn't lift the duty to repent. That's very important, right? And then, we took some of the ahkam of the bay'. He tells us, وَإِذَا قَبَضَ الْمُشْتَرِي الْبَيْعَ في المبيع في البيع الفاسد بأمر البائع وفي العقد عوضان كل واحد منهما مال ملك المبيع ولزمته القيمة. If the buyer takes possession of the item of sale in a corrupt transaction with the order of بأمر البائع, with the order of the seller, order here meaning بإذنه, right? بإذنه, like with the permission of the seller, actual or implicit, and it's a corrupt, not an invalid transaction, meaning that and in the sale there are two items of exchange, each of them is of value, then the buyer owns the item of sale, but what is due to him, lazimatuhu qimatuhu, what is due is the market price of the item, not the thaman, not the agreed upon price, unless he forgoes it or something. But that's problematic. Religiously, is that, if the buyer takes that extra, is that halal for him? Right? And the ulama were cautious about that. But still, the duty remains to either annul the contract or to correct it. Right? So, right? So this would be enforceable if, let's say Zubair sold a mic like this one to Zubaydah, because Zubaydah is starting a podcast called Life with Mr. Z. And she's going to do it anyways. Says, I want to use your mic. Say, no, I'll sell it to you. And they got into an argument. Said, okay, I sell you the mic. And he left. So she decided to use it. So she takes it. Did they agree? They didn't agree on a price. But she took it with his permission. What is due? The qima. So Zubaydah realized, oh my God, we didn't agree on a price. Checked on eBay, for example, how much is the market price for something like this? And very often the market price is much less than you'd imagine. I put something up for sale on eBay. I was thinking I'd get 250 to 300. They said the average selling price of the item was $181. Now I need to figure out how I can cancel the sale, because I don't want to sell it. I got one bidder on it, which is my daughter. She's smart. She said, I'll help you sell it. I'll put a bid on it. I don't know how she has an eBay account, but anyways, she put a bid within minutes, but I haven't followed up. Anyways, so what happens is the aspect that is corrupt, which is non-definition of price, the right thing to do would be for the two to agree on a price. If they do so, then what happens? They've corrected the contract, but both need to repent. But let's say she bought it, found out the market price, and then the neighbor's dog came and bit the mic, got electrocuted, dog died, but the mic was ruined. So now they can't cancel the contract because the item of sale is ruined. So what would be due? The market price. How do they set the market price? Either they could agree that, well, yeah, look, this is the market price. If they can agree on it, then that's great. Or you either agree, or you mediate, or you arbitrate, or you escalate by taking it to court. But nobody has a right to enforce their judgment on another, because you don't have wilaya, authority over the other person. That's why he says, وَلِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِنَ الْمُتَعَاقِدَيْنِ فَسْخُهُ. Right? And this is lam of haqq. Right? That it is the right of each of the two parties to invalidate a corrupt sale unless it was fixed. Right? And this is, the lam here is يحق لكل منهما ويجب لكل منهما. Right? يحق ويجب. Right? It is the right of each party. يحق ويجب it is their right to cancel the transaction, and it is obligatory for them to cancel it unless they correct it. Right? As long as it's possible to still correct. So he says, فَإِنْ بَاعَهُ الْمُشْتَرِي نَفَذَ بَيْعُهُ. Right? But if the buyer takes ownership of it, they own it with this fasad. Right? So they own it, but they يملكه ملكا خبيثا. There's khubth in it. Right? The corrupt sale. فَإِنْ بَاعَهُ الْمُشْتَرِي نَفَذَ بَيْعُهُ. But if the buyer then goes and sells the item, so Zubaydah bought the mic, they didn't set the price. But does she own it? Yes. She didn't even pay for it yet. Paying is not a condition for its validity. Zubaydah goes and sells the mic to the sister. She got an idea, I want to start a podcast too. Zubaydah realized her living with Mr. Z is probably going to cause marital trouble, so she sold it to the sister. You bought it legitimately. You paid your hard-earned $75 for the mic. You got it. Between you and Sister Zubaydah, transaction is fully binding. Zubaydah owned it because the Bay'a Fasid yufidul milk. There is a transfer of ownership. As long as nothing happened affecting the cancellation, both parties have to cancel the contract. But now it's sold to a third party, it can't be cancelled, but Zubaydah still has to pay, of course, the market price, right? And likewise, if other things did, let's say Zubaydah's career as a podcaster didn't work out. So she decided to be a milk farmer. She didn't realize that selling raw milk was illegal in Ontario. So she bought a cow for, I don't know how much cows go for, but she bought a really special cow for $2,000 and put it in the backyard. She's going to start a raw milk business. Zubair had been planning on barbecuing that weekend. He invited 50 people for barbecue. He thought, wow, Zubaydah got us a cow for the barbecue. So he went and slaughtered the cow. Zubayr slaughtered the cow. Zubaydah bought the cow, but she hadn't agreed on the price with the farmer she bought it from. So once the cow is slaughtered, can it be returned? No. So what will be due? The market price. But if Zubaydah bought the cow from the farmer, they hadn't agreed on the price. Until something happens that prevents the return, what do the two parties have to do? Both the farmer and Zubaydah, seller and buyer, they have to either cancel it. They both have the right and the responsibility to cancel it unless they can agree on lifting the the corrupting element, like non-mention of price, for example. If they agreed on the price, it becomes sound. But it's a serious sin. It's a serious sin. Now, an unfortunate reality is in countries where they have good laws, and this includes a lot of the West, and it's not because they're more virtuous as societies, but because there's rule of law. Their transactions, their commercial transactions, tend to be well defined. And that's insofar as they're well defined, they're close to the Sharia. But the problem that happens, that sometimes you hear this and this is a bid'ah. You should never say things like this. You know, a lot of times people say, well, the Muslim community is useless, this, that. This is the community of the Prophet ﷺ. Even if there's faults and weaknesses and failure, it is not permitted to speak ill of the community as a whole. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man qala halaka an-nas fahuwa ahlakuhum." Right? Whoever says the people are ruined, they're the most ruined of them all. Why? Because they've committed dhulm to everybody. The people are all ruined. Firstly, are there no good people amongst them? Number two, that those people do most of them not have at least some good? So that is dhulm against all of them. So you're the worst of them by thinking that. But in another narration, the Prophet says, فَهُوَ أَهْلَكَهُمْ. Whoever said the people are ruined, he is the one who's ruined them. And that's the farq. The riwayah has come, فَهُوَ أَهْلَكُهُمْ. He is the most ruined of them. Or فَهُوَ أَهْلَكَهُمْ. He is the one who's ruined them. Because that's like making dua against the whole community. Because your words count as dua. Right? And a lot of the elders would say this. But it's a lot of evidence from many hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ to support that. That be careful what you say about yourself or others. Because your words are like dua. And the elders would say, be careful what you say because the angels may say Ameen. I used to think that was like really funny. Okay? But it's true. So what happens is very often in the community, things are, people transact with each other, but not in very defined ways. So, were you to buy something from a supermarket or whatever, or you buy a bunch of things from an online store or something, all the terms and conditions are clearly set. Sometimes people say, the worst people to deal with are Muslims. It's not because they're worse, because when we're dealing with like formal commercial transactions, you go to the market, you go to the mall, you go online shopping, whatever, things are clearly defined. But when you buy the Turkish pants from auntie, what happens? There's no invoice, there's no description, there's no price tag, there's no clear terms. Would any store say, yeah, sure, take these 5 items of clothing, we can agree on the price later? Would any store make a sale to you like that? No. So the problem isn't the community, the problem is the lack of law. Right? The problem is our lack of knowledge. These things are very serious. And in many Muslim countries, and we have to have rahmah on the community due to, we're still recovering from several centuries, a couple of centuries of colonization and the systematic destruction of our legal, political, economic, and social systems, that the rule of law in many Muslim countries is weak. Now we have to have a bit of mercy that the ummah has survived like a knockout punch. It's like a knockout punch from which, you're still standing, but if the champion is a bit groggy, it's because, and of course no allowance of boxing, right? But the champion's a little groggy, let them recover their senses. So inshallah, the ummah is still recovering its senses because of what we've gone through, but we see many bad transactional habits in many Muslim countries. I lived in Jordan, had to always warn, whenever you get into a contract, make sure you agree on a price. In Canada, it's against the law. Can a plumber come and fix your plumbing without telling you what they're going to do? without setting a price? Is that even imaginable? No, unless you got like, a desi uncle who's not licensed, then yeah, anything goes. Right? It's not allowed. It's illegal. Like, because if you're a certified plumber or any technician, repairs person, mechanic, etc., they have to tell you, these are the suggested repairs. Which of them do you want? And the price is set beforehand. And these are very Islamic values. But when people do it ourselves, you get your friend. So come, can you paint my house? Because sales, but also same applies to hire. I can do it in a day for this much. Person, it took longer. Now, what was the contract? Was the contract for one day of painting, or was it to paint the whole house? What's the homeowner going to say? If you hired Hamza Colors, it's a bad name for a painter, but so Hamza Colors or Hamza Paints, right? And he said, and he wouldn't say something like that because he'll act on his fiqh. Says, it'll just take me a day to paint your house. I can do it for $100. As the homeowner, do you think you hired him for a day of painting or to paint your whole house? The homeowner, what would they want to interpret it as? To paint the whole house. But the service provider, what would they argue? What would you argue? I just said, I can do it in a day, but it took longer, pay me extra. And then you get absurdity. And both have a case. Now, if you took it to court, the qadi, the judge, would have a way of sorting through that. An adjudicator would have ways of... Now, and if you had something in writing, at least they'd have a bit of an objective way of sorting through the mess. But the worst problem that happens in these kind of informal transactions, there's not even anything in writing. It becomes very difficult. Right? Which is why, and we have a few resources on Seekers about this. The early Muslims used to say, "Kunu ikhwanan wa ta'amalu ka'ajanib," that be brethren, but transact as though strangers. And those of you who buy books together, etc., apply your knowledge to your actions. That someone said, I'll get these books. Are you an agent for the person? Are you this? Are you that? Right? So figure these things out because they're very significant. Okay. And then he says, وَمَنْ جَمْعَ بَيْنَ حُرٍّ وَعَبْدٍ أَوْ شَاةٍ ذَكِيَّةٍ وَمَيْتَةٍ بَطَلَ الْبَيْعُ فِيهِمَا. Right? If in one transaction one joins between selling a free man and a slave, or between a slaughtered sheep and an unslaughtered sheep in one transaction, right? So you sold two things in one transaction, one of which is permitted to sell, the other is not permitted to sell. You can't sell a free person. You can't sell unslaughtered meat. البيع باطل ليس مالا, or ليس مالا متقوما. At the least of it, it's not an item of recognized value for the Muslim. It's غير متقوم. بطل البيع فيهما. Right? The sale is invalid in both items. And this goes back to the issue of, what's this issue called? It's called تعدد الصفقة. When is it considered two transactional items, or is it considered one transaction? So according to Abu Hanifa, تتعدد الصفقة بتعدد الإيجاب والقبول. Abu Hanifa took the way of caution that if two items or more are mentioned in a transaction, the condition for considering each item separately is that there's a separate offer and acceptance. So for example, someone went to pragmatic butcher. He'll slaughter it halal for you if you want, and he'll kosher for it for you if you want, and he'll sell it to you as meita if you want. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. So someone went and bought one halal cow and one dead cow. According to Abu Hanifa, when is it considered two transactions? You say, I buy the zabiha cow for $1,000 and I'll buy the dead cow for $750. There's two separate ijab and qabuls. Then it's considered two transactions. According to the Sahibain, the two companions, if you mention the price of each separately within the contract, I'll sell you the halal cow and the dead cow for $1,750. The halal cow is $1,000. The dead cow is $750. Then, according to the Sahibain, if one of the, this is considered a separable transaction. So, if something happens, like in this case, the dead cow is not fit to be an item of sale. So, according to the Sahibain, according to the Sahibain being the two companions of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, the sale would be binding, would be valid in the halal cow and invalid in the dead one, in the meita. If you mention a separate price for each, the asl in the madhab is that the relied upon position is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, unless the market practice corresponds to the opinion of the Sahibain. So in things that are normally sold for fixed prices, in our times, the relied upon position would be that of the Sahibain. Now you go to the grocery store and one of the items was, so and you can see the fiqh of like eggs and stuff, right? So if you bought eggs and 3 of them were cracked out of a dozen, that's too many broken, right? So, or something else happens. You bought something and turns out it was corrupt. But things like that are bought from the grocery store, etc., these are things sold by fixed prices. So, as long as the price of each is specified, that's like you have, then the sale would be binding. But in things that are sold through negotiation and haggling, then the asl is the position of Abu Hanifa, right? Unless the custom is established to the contrary. So the principle here is that a contract is considered separable into its individual elements, according to Abu Hanifa, if there's an offer and acceptance for each one separately. And that's the more cautious position. The position of the Sahibain is that a contract is considered separable into its individual elements into the individual items of sale, if a price is mentioned for each individual item within the transaction. Where would it be a problem? For example, are houses sold for just standard prices? No. So let's say 2 big real estate agents. So, okay, I'll sell you that property and that property and that property. Right? So now 2 real estate agents. I'm selling you 3 items of property. Right? I want to get out from the UK. Like, I don't know what's going to happen with Brexit. Now, if I'm selling 1 property in London, I want to maximize the price from it. But if you want to buy 3 of them from me, like if I'm selling 3 properties individually, would I sell them for for a higher price than if I'm selling 3 properties together? Yeah, because if I'm selling 3 together, I'm going to give you a discount because I want to get rid of the properties, right? Because if I'm holding on to a whole bunch of properties, so things that are based on negotiation, even if we mention, okay, I'll sell you these 3 properties, this one for £1 million, this for £1.5 million, and this for 2 million. So that's how much? 4.5 million. Yeah? Right? 4.5 million. But that put them together. But individually, it could have been 1.25, 2.5, 1.75. Right? So things that are based on negotiation, even if we mention individual prices, the fatwa would be on the position of the sahibain. This is what the fuqaha tell us. Wallahu a'lam. Okay. Then, what's the next issue? No, we've missed something. Okay. Bismillah. So, وَإِن جَمَعَ بَيْنَ عَبْدٍ وَمُدَبَّرٍ أو عبده وعبد غيره صح في العبد بحصته من الثمن. Right? If one joins between a slave and a slave who is mudabbar, who, there is a plan of how, a financial plan of how he'll be made free, or between one's own slave and someone else's slave. Can you sell someone else's slave? No. The sale is valid in the slave with their share of the price. Because these other items were in of themselves sellable. Right? So there is an item of value, it's just not permitted for you to sell it. So here, even Imam Abu Hanifa deemed the sale to be valid. So let's use a practical example. Let's say Zubaydah didn't end up buying the mic from Zubayr. Right? She bought her own mic. And they both agreed, look, we won't do podcasts about each other. So without Zubaydah's permission, Zubayr sold his mic and her mic to Sidi Hamza for $200. Now, was Zubaydah's mic an item of recognized value? Right? It's a sellable item. But did Zubayr have the right to sell it? Did he? No. So in this case, the sale would be valid, even according to Abu Hanifa, but only in Zubayr's share of the sale. Unless, of course, Zubaydah agreed for the sale to take place, that becomes a separate matter. Is that clear? Okay. Then he says, so this is now some of the corrupting elements in the sale. Right, so we looked first at the things that invalidate the sale, the bay' batil. Then we look at the things that render a sale corrupt. Now we come to, and these would be so cool if you actually diagram them. Right? And then he says, وَنَهَى رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ عن النجش وعن الصوم على صوم غيره وعن تلقي الجلب. So these are called البيوع المكروهة وبيع الحاضر للبادي. وعن البيع عند أذان الجمعة وكل ذلك يكره ولا يفسد به العقد. Okay. So how many issues does he mention under the بيوع المكروهة? 5. Okay. So the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, these are some of the shakli things that the later scholars didn't like in Quduri. Right? That all these rulings, or not all, many of the rulings are directly taken from hadith. Now, it's not from the norm of a matan, of a summary work, to mention the evidentiary basis. That's the role of the commentary. Al-Quduri doesn't follow that throughout. Now, it's up to him, it's his book, right? Like, later norms do not necessarily apply to earlier scholars. Number one. Number two is my book. You don't like it, don't read it. Ma'as-salama, right? Like it's, right? Now, later when the mutun, the primers became widespread, they became an established norm, right, of what you include in a primer or not. But the issue here is, he says, Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have to be aware that some things in Quduri don't work according to the urf, the custom, but this is a urfun tariq. This is a later custom. He's not bound by it. And number two, it's not some shari'i custom. It's just a convention of the scholars. You don't have to stick to the convention. Someone doesn't like the convention, don't read the book. Like, it's not, like if, let's say, I wrote a book in hadith. I begin with the hadiths that I love the most, then the hadiths I really like, then hadith that I've memorized, then hadith that I've read and I'm interested in, and then hadiths that I'm not familiar with, then other hadiths that I don't understand. I wrote the book like this. Now you bought the book and you're upset. Why did he order it this way? That's your problem. Because I wrote the book, I want to order it in this way. If you don't like it, give it away, right? But don't complain, right? So, but it's good to be aware of these things, right? So some things when the ulama are corrected, we should be aware that there is a point, but don't like exaggerate. So he says, and this is one of the things, is tabarrukan. Sometimes fiqh can be dry. It's good to remind ourselves of manba' al-ahkam, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam an najash. Najash, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam forbade false bidding. False bidding, as Al-Maydani mentions, وهو أن يزيد في الثمن ولا يريد الشراء ليرغب غيره. It's to false bid just to raise the price. So let's say that Sidi Hamza his paint business didn't work. He'd bought $50,000 worth of paint. Right? Right? But it didn't work because he bought really expensive paint and he set high prices, and being a student of knowledge, he set timings for doing the painting that don't work for anybody. He also got a bad rep for his painting, but we'll leave that one aside. So what happens? He's trying to sell off his paint, $50,000 worth of paint. But Sidi Hamza is committed not to lying. Because especially read about how Hanafis are very strict about misimpressions. So he said, I'm just going to speak the truth. So why are you selling the paint? Because I bought the paint, but my business failed miserably. He says, how much will you sell it for? Pay what you can. So he's selling it for very low. So a cousin of his feels bad for Sidi Hamza. So his cousin comes and starts bidding to help raise the price. Now, in the normal case, false bidding is makruh tahriman, because it's deceiving the actual buyer. Because what did they used to do in the market? Let's say you want to sell all those clothes that you got from auntie, because you bought them too late in the wedding season. So you want them to be sold. So what did you do? You got someone to make a false bid. You got the sister to put a bid just to raise the price. This is, or if someone started bidding, you get a false bidder in to just raise the price. This is makruh, tahriman, because it's cheating the actual buyer. They said that there is an exception to this, which is إلا إذا كان البائع مغبونا بحيث لا يتمكن من البيع يعني بقيمة السوق, unless the seller always gets cheated such that they're not able to sell within the range of the market price. So in the case of Sidi Hamza, really nice guy. Whoever comes, like he gives them discounts, say pay what you can, this and that. They tell me more about it. Like he ends up, let's say that each can of paint is worth $100, you end up selling for less than the market price. So there, if someone makes some bids just to raise it up to the market price with caution, this is permissible. But this is khilaful asl. This is contrary to the basis. It requires caution. That's a najash, false bidding. وَعَنِ الصَّوْمِ عَلَى صَوْمِ غَيْرِهِ. And this is an important one to be aware of. And the Prophet forbade bidding over another's bid. And this is, as Allama al-Maydani mentions, and this is held across the vast majority of Islamic scholarship, هذا إذا تراضى المتعاقدان على مبلغ المساومة. Right? Bidding on another's bid is only makruh when the buyer and the seller, the prospective buyer and seller, have agreed to the terms. But all that's left is for them to make the actual contract. Right? Because in negotiation, right? So they've agreed to the terms. All that's left is they're just filling out the details, but they've agreed to the price. That's the critical part of the negotiations. They've agreed to the price. But agreeing to the price is not the sale yet. Once the two parties have agreed to the price, then to put a bid after they've agreed to the price is makruh tahriman. It's sinful. Right? But outbidding another, so bidding on the, so you could translate this, so ala sawmi ghayrihi, bidding on the agreed to bid of another. Right? But just, bidding with other people, like an auction sale, is permissible. Rather, it's actually established that sallallahu alayhi wasallam bay'a man yazid. The Prophet ﷺ purchased through auction, where he outbid another. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's done ethically. There's some tricky elements to bidding, which the ulama talk about in its due place. Similarly, in the commentator mentions, وَعَنِ الْخِطْبَةِ عَلَى خِطْبَةِ غَيْرِهِ. The Prophet ﷺ forbade proposing on the proposal of another. When is proposing over the proposal of another in marriage sinful? It's when the two parties agreed to marry. Right? And then you propose, this is makruh tahriman, because it leads to some serious. Right? But there's no engagement yet. Right? The two parties have not agreed to marry yet. The proposal hasn't been accepted. Because acceptance of proposal, is it marriage? No. So, of course, still it requires discretion. Because hurting another's feelings unnecessarily. But a sister once mailed the answer service at Seekers that she was devastated because she consulted a friend of hers about a brother she wanted to marry and was thinking, how do I contact him? So the sister she consulted went and proposed to the guy and they got married. But just legally, was she sinful? No. If no proposal was made and accepted, this is not considered to be sinful. But insofar as you hurt another's feelings, now there, one of the tricky things in our times, in terms of akhlaq, is that shar'an, what can you demand from others? What do you have a right to demand from others? Your rights and nothing else. And when can you feel wronged by another? If they deny you your rights. That's it. But a lot of times people feel, like if I'm walking down the street and I didn't give salam to Zubair, does he have a right to be upset with me? No. Because is it his right that I give salam to him? No. It's sunnah for me to give salam to him, but frankly, it's sunnah for him to give salam to me as well. Right? It's not. Now, it would have been better for me to give salam to him, but there's possibilities. Maybe I didn't see him. Right? Maybe I gave salams, but I mumbled it because I was listening to something else. I didn't actually make the sound. Right? So very often, a lot of the things that people get offended by or upset by, they have no right to get offended or upset because it's not their right. Their right meaning their obligatory right. You cannot demand the sunnah from other people. It's sunnah for him to give salams. If someone walked down the street, cut through a Muslim market, didn't give salam to anybody, were they sinful? They missed out on a lot of sunnahs, but they're lost in thought. Maybe they're involved in doing something much higher. Right? So thinking ill of such a person is haram. But the challenging thing in our times, ulama say to be careful about this, is that even though that may be true, they don't have a right to be upset. But you have to deal with people where they're at. And that's part of mudara, part of discretion and tact, consideration. They say, darihim ma dumta fi darihim. Right? Be tactful with them, be considerate, be discreet with them, as long as you remain in their abode in this world. And this is an essential part of the sunnah. We saw today in an usul al-fiqh class when we're still going through the introduction, that what is al-khuluq al-azim, what is tremendousness of character, is that you act in a way that makes Allah happy and makes people happy. And this is a very hard balance. Now, of course, sometimes it's not possible. Although very often it is through prophetic wisdom. But this is a challenge with respect. You can, but at least on your own side, never be upset at a person. Said, was that your right? No. For example, you called someone 5 times, they didn't call you back. Is it obligatory for them to call you back? No. So you have a right to be disappointed, but do you have a right to be upset with them? No. Do you have a right to have malice towards them? Do you have a right then to backbite them, slander them, tailbear them? No. But it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of this. You have no right to demand your rights, nor to expect your rights. The sunnah is to be easygoing with your rights. Overlook them. Make excuses for them. But strive to have excellence in fulfilling the rights of others. Okay, bismillah, khutbah over. So that is, so with the وَعَنْ تَلَقِّ الْجَلَبِ, or to meet the farmers before they reach the city. And this is one of the things that traders used to do. Imagine that after his failed painting experiment, Sidi Hamza decided to start a fruit orchard, a big fruit orchard, like, 500 acres. Right? And let's imagine this is several hundred years ago in the Niagara, a very lush region. So every year, Hamza apples, Hamza premium apples, HPA. Hamza comes with his premium apples to the market. And everyone wants to buy them. They go really fast. But Hamza is he grows good apples, but he's not an expert trader. So what happens? He has a cousin who's a cunning business person. They said, Hamza comes each year to the market. His apples go really fast. He doesn't really negotiate much, etc. He's the only person growing those kinds of apples in the region. So what would cunning businessman or cunning business person do? Before Hamza reaches the city, you go meet them at the intersection and say, Hamza, why do you need to bother to take your fruit to the city? Sell it all to me. And I'll sell it on your behalf. Go home. Right? Now, this is makruh if it hurts either the city people by someone becoming a monopolist. Right? Or if it hurts the country people by them being deceived, because the farmer doesn't know what's the market price this year, right? So it's not in itself makruh, but it's makruh if it hurts the interests of the city. Why? Because multiple farmers come, they'll go to the marketplace, many people will bid on it, right? So so for the city people, they may have many farmers selling to them, right? For the farmer, if they go to the city themselves, they may be able to get a better price. So the market is able to play it itself out. But if you have only one major distributor selling the apples, what will happen? They'll restrict supply and raise the price. So it hurts the city people. Or the country people may be hurt by this. And a good example of this that in our times is the way most of your cash crops are sold. That the cup of coffee that you drink, when you pay a dollar for it, let's say for any dollar you pay, how much of it goes to the farmer? Do you know how much of it goes to the farmer? Exercise for next week. How much of the dollar of your coffee goes to the farmer? Between regular coffee and fair trade or direct trade. It's easy, there's lots of stats about this online, but it's shocking. It's not more than like a cent or two in the dollar goes to the actual farmer who grew it, who did all the stuff. And a lot of it is because of these intermediaries. Right? It's in the farmer's best interest to sell directly to the market. But all these intermediaries come and they create obstacles for the farmer to be able to sell to the market. There's places in Latin America and elsewhere where farmers who've tried to sell directly themselves have been massacred. Because it's a danger to all the middlemen. The Prophet forbade it. And in general, if someone works as an agent for anything, to be very careful, because being an agent requires a lot of taqwa. Being a middleman, because whose interests are you serving? Are you serving the interests of the person who produced the thing? Not really. You're not serving the interests of the seller either. You're like the shady character in the middle. And it's disliked for both those reasons. But if it doesn't hurt you know, the people of the city, like the customers or the sellers, then it's not makruh, right? And likewise, the Prophet ﷺ forbade بَيْعِ الْحَاضِرِ لِلْبَادِ, the selling of a resident person to a country person. Right? And they say this is during a time of drought. Right? For selling of a resident person to outsiders. That, for example, if we're in a time of drought, and this happens in many developing countries, where they themselves don't have enough crop to feed themselves, but therefore they export. Why? Because they'll make more money elsewhere. But taking care of the needs of one's own land first is given precedence. Right? And this is if it's in a time of drought, for example, or lack of that essential crop, etc. Right? And there's and then he says وعن البيع عند أذان الجمعة. The Prophet ﷺ also forbade selling عند أذان الجمعة. Selling during, meaning from the adhan of Jum'ah. So once the adhan is given, the predominant position in the Hanafi school is that this applies from the first adhan of Jumu'ah, which is the adhan. And normally the first adhan is given for Jumu'ah when Dhuhr time enters. And we look at Babul Jumu'ah, because إِذَا نُودِيَ لِلصَّلَاةِ, right? If the call is given to prayer, مِن يَوْمِ الْجُمْعَةِ, on Friday, فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, so rush to the remembrance of Allah. So the predominant interpretation is that the command, فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ, that there's a condition. If the call is given on Friday, which is the first adhan, then rush to the remembrance of Allah and leave your transactions. So therefore, the predominant opinion and the more direct interpretation of the verse is, once the first adhan is given, then all uqud, all transactions, which includes working, or imtidadu aqdin, which is like in the case of just doing your work, is impermissible for those Jumu'ah is obligatory upon. So buying or selling or any other contract, initiating it or continuing it during that time would be makruh tahriman. And that would include إِذَا تَبَايَعَا وَهُمَا يَمْشِيَانِ, if you transact while walking together to the masjid. Because the command is, once the adhan is given, stop. But this becomes problematic in multiple contexts in our time, especially because even in many Muslim countries, the Jumu'ah is not always held right at the beginning of Dhuhr time. So, for example, now here in Canada, Dhuhr is around noon and a bit. But many places they pray year-round at 1:30. So imagine that would mean for an hour and 15 minutes, men aren't allowed to engage in any transaction. If they actually listened to that and just sat there making dhikr or reciting Quran, We'd have a lot more righteous men in our community, but they're not going to do that. So this is making things difficult for them. And even in the Muslim world, classically there's a second interpretation of the verse, which is the following. This is less strong, but it has textual basis. إِذَا نُودِيَ لِلصَّلَاةِ When the call is given to prayer, من يوم الجمعة, on Friday, فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ Then rush to the remembrance of Allah and leave transaction. So the end point, the purpose of the call and leaving the transaction is what? Is to get to the remembrance of Allah. What's the remembrance of Allah? No. فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ It's the khutbah. There's near agreement on that. إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ There is, the dhikr here is بِمَعنى التذكير, that which reminds you of Allah, which is the khutbah. فَاسْعَوْا إِلَيْهِ Then rush to the remembrance of Allah. And rush the remembrance of Allah and leave trade. So the trade that is not permitted is كل تصرف مخل بالسعي إلى ذكر الله دون تأخير. So the only transactions, the transactions that are not permitted are those transactions that if you engage in it, that transactions or those actions that will cause you to be late to catching the entirety of the dhikr of Allah, which is the khutbah. And that is, the first opinion is more cautious, but the second opinion, and it's actually legally stronger, but the second interpretation is far more applicable in our times, and this is discussed extensively by many of the great muftis of the Indian subcontinent, and many have written about it. Why? Because applying the other position would entail that you couldn't take an Uber to Jumu'ah once Dhuhr time has come in, or take whatever mode of transportation. You couldn't take a bus once Dhuhr time has come in. It would cause a lot of problems. But if someone wanted to be cautious, then caution is clear. So they mention عند الأذان الأول, that's the more rigorous opinion, but there are two opinions in the madhab. You can find the details of that in Bab al-Jumu'ah, and we'll touch upon that when we get to it as well. He says, وَكُلُّ ذَلِكَ Each of these prophetic prohibitions, يُكْرَهُ, right, are disliked, meaning prohibitively disliked. وَلَا يَفْسُدُ بِهِ الْعَقْدِ But they do not corrupt the transaction. Right? Because the prohibition relates to meaning outside the subject matter of the transaction itself. So if someone bought, so let's say I'm walking to Jummah, on the way I find a stall that's selling tasbihs. So, I don't have a tasbih on me. How much is a tasbih? $5. I bought it for $5, continued walking, got to Jummah early. If Dhuhr time is in, according to the more strict opinion, this is makruh. But did the prohibition relate to the sibha itself? No. Now masajid, if they give permission to people to sell outside the masjid, like in the parking lot, then it's the responsibility, because the masjid is min sha'airillah. It is from the great symbols of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's very important. It's a moral obligation on the administration of the masjid to take the reasonable means with wisdom, with tact, to ensure that there's not flagrant violation of the divine command. Right? So there's some things that require wisdom. People come in improperly dressed, we want to welcome them because the reason for weakness of practice would be weakness of faith or unawareness of faith. So where would you cultivate that other than the masjid? Right? But that's very different. Wisdom in dealing with newcomers, converts, people reconnecting. That's different from people who just aren't obeying the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or who are not aware. So therefore, it's a duty, and the examples of this in Islamic history, of there being clear guidelines for traders. And that, okay, yeah, you can sell in the masjid, but these are, the simple guidelines. And one of them is that in sufficient time, because it's not just the minimum, but you're selling in the masjid, that with sufficient time before the adhan is given, all sales in the masjid, on masjid property, have to be stopped. Because otherwise, the masjid has given permission for the common Muslim to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many people, you see that you go to the masjid, they're still buying the mangoes. Why? Because uncle is worried, if I don't buy the mango now, the Pakistani mangoes are going to run out. That's a big problem. Not because the big problem is the mango is running out. You've just helped someone disobey Allah, because while buying the mangoes, the khutbah has begun. Right? So those are very important things, right? And these things cause disrespect of religion. Anyways. And then he says, وَمَنْ مَلَكَ مَمْلُوكَيْنِ صَغِيرَيْنِ أَحَدُهُمَا ذُو رَحِمٍ مَحْرَمٍ مِنَ الْآخَرِ لَمْ يُفَرِّقْ بَيْنَهُمَا. If someone owns two young slaves, one of them is a blood relation of the other, like siblings, then it is not permitted to separate between them, because it'll hurt their feelings. وَكَذَلِكَ إِنْ كَانَ أَحَدُهُمَا كَبِيرًا. And likewise, if one of them is older, like a mother and their child, for example, etc., it's a sin. فَإِنْ فَرَّقَ بَيْنَهُمَا كُرِهَ لَهُ ذَلِكَ. And if one separates between them, this is prohibitively disliked. وَجَازَ الْبَيْعَ أي صح. But the sale will be valid. وَإِنْ كَانَا كَبِيرَيْن فَلَا بَأْسَ بِالتَّفْرِيقِ بَيْنَهُمَا. But if both of them are adult, then there's nothing wrong with such a sale. So this is completing the section on al-bay'u al-fasid, and it would be important to review the items that I mentioned early on from the Majalla, etc., because there's benefit there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Then we have the section on the cancellation of sales, babul iqala. And the cancellation of sales, in general, this is from the virtues of trading. It's a recommended act to accept a cancellation of a sale. It's not obligatory. The buyer can't demand it. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man aqala nadiman athratahu, aqala Allahu atharatihi yawm al-qiyamah." Whoever cancels the error of another, right? Whoever cancels the erroneous sale of another, Allah will cancel their errors on the day of resurrection. Right? And this is particularly when someone made a bad mistake, etc. So we'll see the fiqh of it. And then we'll look at what are called buyu'ul amana, trust sales. And the simple thing with trust sales is don't do them. And then we have the section on riba. Na'udhu billahi minha. If someone wants to prepare for the section on riba, there is a brilliant and very influential article by Mufti Taqi Usmani, which is his article, which is his treatise on, and this is something that I would recommend any student knowledge to go through and summarize. Right? Which is the Supreme Court judgment on on riba, if says Supreme Court riba, Taqi Usmani, you should be able to find it. If it's not up on Seekers, someone could check the answer service. We should have it up. If we don't, Omar, could you ask Sidi Sufyan to put it up? I'm pretty sure we'd have it somewhere or the other. And that's very important. And he goes through what is riba and many of the common objections to riba, etc. And we'll look at that when we get to it, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. I didn't have my copy of Quduri with me here, so remind me next class we'll look over if there's any important footnotes that are missing. I think we caught most things, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.